Hey folks, Brian here. Today I'm upgrading my PC, an AMD FX 8300 running with 28 gigabytes of DDR3 memory with different speeds and latencies in the wrong slots. It's got a Asus GeForce RTX 2070 Super that I recently put in. I had to get rid of the case because the graphics card was just too big. And the graphics card is running in a PCIe 2.0 express slot. The power supply is a good one, a 650 watt Seasonic that's lasted probably about 8 years now. I've got a bunch of SSDs here, one older MX300 as the boot drive, one MX500, 2 terabyte drive, two 2 terabyte Samsung 860 EVOs, and one 500 gigabyte Samsung OEM drive that I salvaged from a laptop. For DaVinci Resolve, I found out the performance was much improved with the RTX 2070 Super. Nevertheless, the whole UI and Windows 10 was overall still very sluggish. And I had been planning this build for at least half a year. My friend and I wanted to create content creation machines, and the FX 8300 wasn't gonna cut it. But now it's time to soup everything up, go to the extreme, and the motherboard of choice that I picked is the Aorus X570 Xtreme. Originally I didn't want to go with this motherboard. It's just too expensive and I wanted to get the Aorus Master. And I was also considering for most of the time an Asus Crosshair Hero 8. The Hero had more ports on the back. It had 8 SATA ports, but only 2 M2 NVMe slots. The Master, on the other hand, had less ports on the back, but it supposedly had the better VRM with more direct phases. I splurged at the last moment and got the Xtreme. One of the main benefits, besides the overkill VRM, was the lack of a chipset fan. I figured if I was going to use this motherboard for a long time, I didn't want another potential mechanical failure, and I also got scared by a lot of Reddit posts about loud fans, but it probably wasn't something I needed to worry too much about. I'm sure both the Master and the Crosshair Hero would have worked just fine for my needs. With the Aorus Xtreme, I got the overkill VRM to hopefully worry less about temperatures. I've got all the ports on the back of the Crosshair Hero. I still have the 3 M2 slots of the Master. So I sort of think it combines best of both worlds, and it also knocks out that annoying chipset fan right below the primary PCIe graphics card slot. So that's why I got the Aorus Xtreme. Here it is. And we're going to build the PC on top of a box. First, it's time to install the CPU. We raise the metal fastening bar on the AM4 socket up. Then we take the Ryzen 3950X chip and we put it into the socket. One corner of the socket has a triangle. It doesn't look like the other ones. And the chip itself has a golden triangle on one of its corners, and these need to match. Afterwards, push down on the fastener to lock the chip into place. Next, we need some CPU cooling for our CPU. So I bought this H150i Pro. It's a 360mm radiator and fan AIO, and it has 320mm fans. And the idea was to get the longest possible radiator and 3 fans, so the fans wouldn't have to spin too much to keep the CPU cool, thus reducing noise in my room. And it comes with pre-applied thermal paste. And since I know I was going to have to take this computer apart again when the case comes, I decided to take advantage of that, even though it's typically recommended to use your own thermal paste, since you never know how long it's been sitting in the box. You have to install a couple clips on each side and hook them onto the base of the motherboard. That's not too bad, and then you simply screw in 2 screws. There's a lot of cables for this. For instance, there's a USB cable that needs to be hooked into the motherboard. This allows the cooler and the pump and everything to be controlled by the Corsair iQ software. iQ is a bloated program that runs in the background. It allows you to set the color of the cooler and any other Corsair devices so you can synchronize all the colors. One thing I noticed is when you put the computer to sleep, the program stops and the fan goes back to its regular unicorn RGB barf mode, and when you resume from sleep, it takes a couple seconds for it to load your settings. Finally, iQ also tends to crash in the background. So far, I haven't had a very good experience with it. Also from the pump are several connectors for each of the fans. Each fan has its own connector and it plugs into the main pump, which has a cable that splits into 3 other cables. And finally, there's one more cable that goes to an SATA power source so that the whole thing can have power. I mounted the fans so it would look like what is on the box. For now, I don't think it matters which direction, whether pushing or pulling so much, since this is being built outside the box. I'll revisit that once I get the case. Next up, I installed 4 sticks of 16 gigabytes of Trident Z Neo memory. This was 3600 megahertz, 1616, 1636 timings. So this was the so-called, well, maybe it was the so-called Samsung B die. And after I installed the 4 sticks, the default XMP profile was actually there in the BIOS. These memory sticks aren't on the QVL for the Aorus Xtreme because I think they test all the memory on the Aorus Master, which they probably sell with much greater numbers. So even though I enabled XMP, it defaulted to a pretty slow speed. I think it was 1000 megahertz. So I manually set the memory speed to 1800 megahertz, the Infinity Fabric speed that is. I manually adjusted the voltage to 1.35 volts as listed in the product description, and then all 4 sticks ran as advertised at 3600 megahertz with 16-16-16. Before I was running with 15-15-15 at a lower megahertz, which was kind of interesting. Anyway, I only really needed 32 gigabytes of memory, I think. I got 64 gigabytes though because it went on a sharp discount, and I knew that I'd eventually have to fill that urge of filling all 4 slots, just like I did with my last build. But I didn't want to end up with all different speeds, latencies, and makes, and different models and all that, so I just bit the bullet now. I did find out later that one RGB light on one of the sticks wasn't working properly, so I RMA'd that. And then when I went to 3 sticks, the megahertz didn't work. It dropped down to 1000. I then went down to 2 sticks, but in the wrong slots. And that also couldn't be boosted up to 1800. So then after I put the 2 sticks in the recommended slots, which are the 2 slots that are staggered and further away from the CPU cooler, that went up to 36 megahertz just fine, and all was well. These were expensive sticks. I gotta admit, I sort of fell for that RGB barf look. I kinda really liked how these looked, so I bought them. Then I put back the 2070 Super into the topmost PCIe slot for best performance. Also, I noticed there was a performance and a quiet mode switch. In performance mode, the fans barely spin while I'm browsing the internet, and quiet mode, they stopped altogether. But quiet mode, it smelled kind of funny, like something was burning up, so I changed it back to performance mode. Also, there are some additional plugs to connect fans to, so the GPU can control the fans. I didn't bother trying that yet, since I don't have a case to put any extra fans. Finally, for the first test post, I connected the 24-pin motherboard power cable I then connected one of the 8-pin CPU cables. I did notice there was a second 8-pin for the CPU, and my power supply, it only had an extra 4-pin for an extra CPU power. I tried to fit it in, but the shape of the prongs wouldn't let me, so I just stuck with one 8-pin. And then I powered it up, and with a flash of RGB, it actually posted, and it seemed to work perfectly fine. Of course, then I realized I needed to install the M2s and take out the graphics card and all that. But this was a really good sign, and I was happy it went smoothly for once. So I purchased two 2TB Intel 660p solid state drives. These run as PCI 3 interfaces. So I wanted to use the first two sockets on the Aorus Xtreme motherboard. If I used the third socket, that would disable 2 of the SATA ports, SATA ports, of the 6. And since I have 5 solid state drives at the moment, I didn't want to do that. So I took off the heatsink for the first M2 socket, and that's all you need to do for the first M2 socket. I put the M2 in at an angle. I installed a standoff because it was shorter length than the entire socket. I screwed it down with included screws. On the heatsink, I made sure to take the blue seal so that the thermal pad would be in direct contact with the chips, and screwed it back together. For the second 660p, I had to take all 5 screws off for not only the heatsink, but also the chipset. It comes off in one big connected piece. Once again, I made sure to take off the blue seal, put in the M2 at an angle, installed the standoff, screwed it down, and then put the heatsink back on and all 5 screws. After that, I installed the SATA cables, and finally I put the graphics card back in. After that, I did another test post, saw that the drives were listed, and it all seemed to work. To wrap things up, I decided to make sure Windows was updated to the latest update. I ran Windows Update, made sure that I didn't have any updates queued. I just applied them all. I rebooted, made sure it worked. Then I also updated the Aorus Xtreme motherboard BIOS. I remember using a FAT32 formatted USB key, putting on the file in the drive, and just using the BIOS to install it. It was pretty simple. Everything worked. I did try to change the RGB colors of the RAM using the G.SKILL utility, and it worked. But I did find out that one of the sticks, I think, always illuminates red no matter what, so the colors don't come out right. So I RMA'd that. As for the case, I think during transit, there was a problem with the UPS, and there was a big rip in the box, and the whole plastic was shattered in the front. So I returned it. I probably might have been able to contact Fractal Design and have them send me a new front plate. But I decided to just return it for now. I'm kind of waiting for the Meshify S2 to go on discount again, or at least become available. I haven't seen it except for very high prices. But everything's working smoothly, and I hope to put this in a case before everything gets covered in dust. But till then, this is the new workstation for 2020. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. See you later. Bye.